Hello, Cohort B. Today we're going to go through a presentation together before you do some work independently. This presentation is how light and shadows visually define objects in our first unit called Lurking in the Shadows. So some of this will be review from Art Foundations, but let's take a look. So if you see a drawing here of a sphere, the reason this object looks three-dimensional or that it has height, width, and depth is because the artist rendered highlights, which are the lightest part on the drawing, our midtones, and then the shadows, which are the darkest part of the drawing. So, can you tell where this light source is coming from? So, the lightest part on an object is where the light is hitting it. So right here, our highlight, we would know that our light source is coming from the right, over here, and because the shadow is on the opposite side. So we have two different types of shadows. One are our form shadows. Those are created when the side of an object turns away from the light. Basically, it's the shadow on an object. The second type of shadow is a cast shadow, and these are created basically when your object is in front of a light source. So it's the shadow made by the object. So if this ball was sitting on a table, it would be the shadow on the table. If you have a hard time figuring out what the shadow would look like or the shape, you first look at where the light is coming from, and you can actually map it out. So if I took a ruler just where these blue lines are and went from the light source and drew a line to the side of the right side of the object and the left side, that's where I know where my shadow would land. One thing we'll continue talking about in this unit is value. Value is one of our elements of art, and value just means the lightness or darkness of a color. So if you're creating a drawing with a lot of contrast, you'll have a lot of different values from the light, from white to light grays, our medium tones, all the way to our darkest shadows, which are black. Value can be created two ways. One is just varying the pressure of your drawing instrument. So if I'm using a pencil and I press really light, obviously I'm going to have lighter values. If I'm pressing harder, my values are going to look darker. The second way is when you're using a different shading technique, spacing and overlapping your marks. So the example down there at the bottom is stippling or shading with dots. When the dots are overlapping and they're very close together, you'll see here on the left, it represents a very dark value. As they get more spaced out and lighter, you'll see it looks like a much lighter value at the other end of the value scale. Another review for elements of art are shape and form. So the differences between the two, a shape is something that's two-dimensional or something that has height and width. A form is an object that is three-dimensional, so it encloses volume and has height, width, and depth. So comparing these two, a square would be a shape and a cube would be a form because it's showing that object receding back into space. So we're going to review some shading techniques and then I'm going to show you another one. So the first one you learned in Art Foundations was called hatching. So hatching is just defined as shading with closely spaced parallel lines. The big thing to remember with hatching is that your shading lines need to follow the contours of the form. So in this car, this side of the car is flat and they just drew their hatching lines diagonally. Now, if you're looking at the form of this hand, there are curved lines. Those curved lines make the hand look more three-dimensional. If they were just straight across, it would look very flat. So here's another difference. When you're doing shading, you also need to think about the planes of a form. So if you're looking at this model here, the planes of a face, when a light is hitting this face, different areas are going to be more raised than others. So the one that's raised the most is our highlights, our lightest part here, and it gets darker on a further back on these planes. So this is kind of an example of how an artist would render that as well. So you can see the planes here are darker, lighter on the top of the nose, and that creates that three-dimensional depth in a drawing. Second technique is cross-hatching, and very similar to hatching, but you're just overlapping those parallel lines. So you can see same thing on this hand. You'll see some of those lines are curved, and then at an angle, you'll see more lines overlapping and overlapping. The more they overlap, the darker the value will have. So this is the difference here. This is just a real quick example of a pair of lips. This drawing looks like it was almost has some type of texture or rough barbed wire on the lips, whereas since these lines are following the contours of the form, the lips are round, they curve up, that makes it look more realistic. The third one to review is stippling, which is shading with dots, and that's what we looked at on that value scale. And you can do it a lot of different ways with different media, from pencil to pen. You'll see on the teapot here, the shadow here is represented with the dots very close together, and the same thing with here with the eye. The last one for a review is blending. So you will have a tortillon or a blending stick in your bag of art supplies. That is that white thing that's paper rolled up real tight. And blending creates very soft transitions of values. It's just when you're smudging whatever media you're using to create different values. So if you're trying to get something to look as realistic as possible, like a face, blending would be a good choice for a shading technique. The last one is called scumbling. And scumbling is kind of just like scribbling. You're just making tiny little circles and loops and moving your pencil or pen or whatever you're drawing with around the page. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as the Brillo pad technique, but it just kind of gets a different appearance in a drawing and just kind of a different feel to the drawing as you're working. So here's an example of scumbling. This artist layered 3 different colors on here, blue, red, and black pen. And those scribbly, scumbling marks of shading gives this drawing a lot of energy. And here's another example. When you're scumbling and creating a very dark value, all your lines almost blend together. That is it for this presentation. Thanks for listening, everybody.